Dr. Berj H. Haidostian was a beloved physician in the community, and a family has been a supporter of this university and program for many, many years. And Alice Haidostian, we are very happy you are here with us. We've had very distinguished lectures in these series, and today's lecturer is no less than any that we have invited to speak to us. Egoyan is an author, director, producer, and a visionary. With 14 feature films and related projects, Egoyan has won numerous awards, including 5 prizes at the Cannes Film Festival, including the Grand Prix, the International Critics Award, the Ecumenical Jury Prizes. He's been nominated for 2 Academy Awards, 8 Genie Awards. He's won prizes from the National Board of Review and an award for Best International Adaptation at the Frankfurt Book Fair. In 2010, he had a full retrospective of his films at the Filmoteca Española in Madrid, following similar events in previous years at the Pompidou Center in Paris and the Museum of the Moving Image in New York. Egoyan won the 2010 Douglas Sirk Award from the Hamburg Film Festival, joining other career honors from festivals and events in Tokyo, Jerusalem, Reykjavik, Las Palmas, Hong Kong, Cairo, and the Panorama of European Cinema in Athens. He has been president of the jury in Cannes, Berlin, Venice, as well as jury member at several other festivals, including Sundance, Toronto, and Tribeca. Egoyan's art projects have been presented around the world, including the Venice Biennale and Artangel in London. Steenbeckert has recently become part of the Artangel collection, an innovative alliance with the Tate Museum in London. The collection will tour museums and galleries across the UK. Egoyan's acclaimed production of Wagner's Die Walküre won a Dora Award for Outstanding Opera Production, and his adaptation of Samuel Beckett's A Joe was presented by the Gate Theatre in Dublin, where it won the Irish Times ESB Award for Best Direction before transferring to London's West End and the Lincoln Center Festival in New York. Egoyan directed the North American premiere of Martin Krimp's Cruel and Tender, which stars Arsine Khanjian for the Canadian Stage Theatre Company in early 2012. He will remount Salome with the Canadian Opera Company in 2013. Many of you will have seen the films for which he has become famous and won these awards: Chloe, Adoration, Where the Truth Lies, Felicia's Journey, The Sweet Hereafter, Exotica, Calendar, The Adjuster, Speaking Parts, Family Viewing, Next of Kin. And of course, Ararat, which he will review with us 10 years after its production. Please join me in welcoming an old friend, a very dear friend from the 80s, and someone with whom we had a very long discussion in our house in Cambridge that lasted all afternoon. And then after that, after 20-some years, saw him again today at noon, and as if we had never left, and we continued that discussion today. Please welcome Egoyan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It was an incredible afternoon that we spent in Cambridge those many years ago. I was there after having made my first feature, and I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with my life. And at that point, Girard was in a very different mode. And we talked a lot about the Armenian condition and identity, and I don't think either of us could have dreamt of what was going to happen in those intervening 20 years, certainly not. The idea of independence, Girard going there, being on the front lines, and we were talking today, of course, about now coming back into a place where he's able to speak with his students, both as an academic and as a practitioner. And it's something that I've been privileged to do over the past few years. It's been tricky with my schedule, obviously, but I've spent time at the University of Toronto and this year at Ryerson giving time to students and trying to allow them a peek into my practice and spending time with them. So quite an evolution over those 20 years in terms of where we both are. But somewhere within those 20 years, about 10 years ago, actually 10 years ago this May, there was the premiere of Ararat at the Cannes Film Festival. And while this may not be perhaps the most critically acclaimed film I've done universally, I have no doubt that it's the most important work I've ever produced. And what I'd like to do today is really take some time to reflect on the film 10 years after. And for those of you who have seen the film, you'll know that it follows a very unconventional structure, that it's not linear. It moves around a lot, and I'd like to try and do that a little bit with the lecture, but from three different perspectives. The first is the perspective of a scholar who's written a book on my work, Jonathan Romney, an English scholar who had a book published by the British Film Institute some years ago. And his perspective is interesting because he's been a huge admirer of my work. Of course, he wrote a book on it, but he wasn't so sure where to place Ararat. So we'll be looking at his perspective. And then we'll be looking at the perspective of Peter Papas, who's a Greek scholar who wrote a very interesting essay because he wasn't a huge fan of my previous films, but really responded to Ararat and presented an interesting point of view and perspective of it, which I found was really encouraging in as much as his ability to understand what the film was attempting to do. And then I'll be also using elements of a paper that I presented about 2 years after the film was made. It was published in the University of Toronto Quarterly in the summer of 2004, and the essay was called In Other Words, Poetic License and the Incarnation of History. And it was an examination of some of the ideas that were going through my mind as I was making the film. So what I'll do is, as I say, this is an unusual and unorthodox way of presenting a lecture, but what I wanted to do more than anything else was to create a forum for discussion afterwards. So we'll move through this. I'll be showing some clips from the film, not a lot, but they're sustained clips because some of you here may have not seen the film and or haven't seen it for a long time. So when we look at the clips, you'll be back into that space. But we'll get to those, and I'll contextualize those clips as I get to them. So let's start off with Jonathan Romney's look at the film. And then as we move through, I'll tell you who we're listening to. And then I'll stop doing that. And I've structured this in a way that I think all the ideas will kind of flow together in some way or another. It's a bit of an experiment, but as I say, I think it kind of keeps to the spirit of the film itself. So he starts by saying that much of my work, directly or indirectly, can be read as dealing with the scars left by the disappearance or dispersion of a people. Some are haunted in a general sense by images of deracination. The Sweet Hereafter deals with mourning for a lost future. Family Viewing warns of the traumas created by the suppression of a past. Earlier films, Next of Kin, Calendar, Open House, more or less explicitly address the experience of the Armenian diaspora. Not surprisingly, there had long been speculation as to whether or not Egoyan would ever directly address the historic question of the Armenian Genocide. But, as Egoyan explains, quote, I had to wait until I found a perspective on it, to find out why I needed to tell the story and why it needed to be told. The story he did eventually tell in his 2002 film Ararat took shape partly at the prompting of producer Robert Lantos, co-founder of Alliance Atlantis, and later the lead head of his own Serendipity Point Films. I had asked Robert to introduce me at a function at the Armenian Community Center in 1999, and he had produced or been involved with the distribution of many of my films up to that point, and I thought he'd be a good person to introduce me to the community who was honoring me that night. And it was a remarkable evening because he got up to the podium and addressed 1,000 people, looked at them all, and said, as a Hungarian Jew, I've seen many films about the Holocaust, and the trauma of my people has been explored in many different ways, but I've never seen a film about the Armenian Genocide, and if Adam is ready to make that film, I'm ready to finance it. At which point, everyone stood up on their feet and started cheering, and I was just kind of going, oh no, what have you unleashed, Robert? What have you unleashed? And later on, he told me the conditions of it is that it had to be done very quickly. It had to be done literally, the money had to be spent by the end of 18 months. So to give you some background, I mean, how do you even begin to conceive of a film and shoot it and get it finished within 18 months? I looked at a script that I had written in my early 20s, which was based on Clarence Usher's book, which we'll talk about later on. I took out that script, read it, and I realized I understood immediately why I rejected it at that point. First of all, it was way too big to even dream of doing something like that in my early 20s. But it also didn't really talk about what I was feeling about the history at that moment. Anyway, Robert, again, pledged himself to this film, and it wouldn't have been made without his support. Egoyan was determined not to respond to the challenge in an obvious way. And he's quoting me, I mean, the book is there if you want to make a classical, historical, epic film about the genocide, the book being the 40 Days of Musa Dagh. But who would direct such a film? Not me. So instead of making an Armenian Schindler's List, as some press coverage predicted Ararat would be, he wanted to explore an analytical perspective on the genocide, to tell a story about historic events while inquiring how such stories can be translated to screen without traducing their meaning. Such a film would have to critique the type of spectacular reconstruction of historical atrocity of which Steven Spielberg's 1993 Holocaust drama has been the most prominent example. So now we'll switch to Peter Pappas's essay, which is titled Speak Memory, which begins with this very interesting quotation from William Faulkner, which is, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." The first time I came across Adam Egoyan's work was in Salonika in the early 90s at the Thessaloniki Film Festival, where he was the subject of a tribute. Seeing that he had made only 4 features at that point and was in his early 30s, I thought that this was a little premature. In any case, I took advantage of the opportunity to see 3 of his films, Next of Kin, Family Viewing, and The Adjuster. As it turned out, I would have found out about Egoyan sooner rather than later. His next film after Calendar, Exotica, was his breakthrough or crossover movie. He went on to make Sweet Hereafter, Felicia's Journey, and a film version of Krapp's Last Tape. Ararat is a return to his earlier narrative typologies, if not quite to subject matter, which has remained surprisingly consistent with its issues of identity, individual and communal, and memory, and the refractions thereof. In a way, it was serendipitous to see Egoyan's films in Thessaloniki first. What more fitting venue for a filmmaker from the Armenian diaspora than Greece's preeminent film festival? What more appropriate Greek city than Salonika, a mother of Holocaust and dispersion, a communal catastrophe and historical amnesia, in which to engage the work of a filmmaker born in Cairo, raised and educated in British Columbia, and rooted in the polyethnic purgatory of Asia Minor and the Anatolian Plains. And of course, a film festival is the most opposite context for Egoyan's work, as his movies are self-reflexively cinematic in a manner that is the antithesis of classical découpage. And now I'll switch to this personal reflection. And from here on, as I say, I won't be marking where I'm switching. I'd always wanted to make a film about the Armenian Genocide of 1915. I came to Canada at the age of 2 from Egypt, where both my parents were born. My father's mother, whom I never met, was an orphan of this terrible event, and my grandfather, whom I also never knew, narrowly escaped the wholesale slaughter of my race in the provinces of eastern Turkey. When we arrived in Canada in 1962, my parents made the curious decision to move the family to Victoria, British Columbia. Here, in the westernmost city of the country, I was raised without the three pillars of Armenian identity. There was no community, no Armenian church, and though Armenian was my mother tongue, I refused to speak it at home, and it too was soon lost. Without the community, church, or language, my path towards complete cultural assimilation was virtually assured. I arrived in Toronto in the fall of 1978, convinced that I would make an excellent diplomat. I enrolled myself in the study of international relations at Trinity College at the University of Toronto. At this point, my path was interrupted by two fortuitous meetings. The chaplain of Trinity College happened to be Armenian, and I began to take lessons from him in an attempt to retrieve my mother tongue. Secondly, there was a very active Armenian Student Association on campus, and I became a member. Although I was aware of the Armenian Genocide, its full impact was suddenly revealed to me, and I began to gear all my studies to the analysis of this event. My graduating thesis was an independent studies project on Western responses to the Armenian call for national self-determination on the part of Armenians in the aftermath of this atrocity. Ararat is by far Egoyan's finest and easily his most complex and demanding and therefore significant film. It functions on and seamlessly interweaves, but also defends the complexity of several narrative levels, both scriptural in the Greek sense of graphe, or to put it more modernly, écriture, and memorial in the ancient Greek sense, again, of memory as the mother of history. This is a minority opinion. Critics have tended to damn Ararat with faint praise, especially in comparison to Egoyan's previous films. As someone who cared neither for Exotica nor Felicia's Journey, and who thought that Russell Banks' novel was resurrected in a disconcertingly sweet afterlife in the sweet hereafter, I'm also in the distinct minority as far as the arc of Egoyan's career is concerned. I actually believe that in Ararat, Egoyan has not only finally channeled his film sense into a film form that is of its own molding, but that he has also taken a profoundly brave stand as an Armenian. What is most compelling about Ararat is that, opposed to so many Armenian reflections on the genocide of 1915, it is not obsessed with Turkish guilt over the crimes of the time. Rather, it is deeply concerned with, and like so many of us, morally distressed by, the pathological Turkish denial of the guilt since that time, which the film understands is now the genuinely painful heart of the matter. Egoyan has performed an inestimable service to the historical restitution of the Armenian Genocide and the collective consciousness of the civilized world, which Turkey claims to be a part of, but that, through grotesque disavowal of its history, it confirms daily that it is not, and will not be until it admits to the crimes perpetrated in its name. In 1998, I was nominated for 2 Academy Awards for writing and directing the feature film Sweet Hereafter. This followed on the heels of the film having won 3 prizes in Cannes and appearing on over 250 top 10 lists for that year. In the weeks leading up to the Oscars, I was flown back and forth to New York and Los Angeles, where I was presented at various film industry functions, interviewed on national television, and displayed at any social event where I could be seen. Visibility is an essential ingredient of fame. I didn't win either of the awards that night. Titanic, true to its title, swept through a ceremony that culminated in an uneasy moment when its director, James Cameron, stood in front of the global audience and asked for a few moments of silence in observation of the lives that had been lost on that ill-fated ship. I'll never forget the disturbing sense of power that Cameron exercised that night with the gesture. A few days before, all the nominees had been rigorously coached to keep their acceptance speeches as short as possible. Yet here was this man, the self-proclaimed king of the world, consuming one of the most valuable commodities in that world, airtime during the International Broadcast Academy Awards, to honor the dead. I couldn't help but feel that he was also honoring something else. James Cameron was demonstrating his power to make that statement.
as we in the audience sat dutifully in silence to pay tribute to those lost souls that perished on the Titanic, I noticed several Hollywood producers glancing at each other incredulously. Years before, when he won his award for Schindler's List, Steven Spielberg hadn't gone quite that far. And here we all were, heads bowed in silence to commemorate a group of people we could now only associate with a special effects spectacle rather than this specific historical event. Or had the movie become the historical event? Had the film Titanic somehow bulldozed its way into our collective psyche in such a manner that it became, in effect, a living experience of what it meant to be there? Is this what history has become in our culture? A set of indicators that simulate the experience of what things must have meant. The next morning, I was flown back to Toronto. The party was over, or I should say, the parties. All night long, I had witnessed the elite of Hollywood at a number of social events at a number of legendary places, the Governor's Ball, Chasins, Morton's. Everyone was talking about Cameron's gesture. Can you believe what he did? That he'd have the guts. By the end of the evening, there was no doubt in my mind as to what had been consecrated in that outrageously long vow of silence Cameron had imposed on Hollywood and the rest of the world that night. What had made the gesture so unsettling? In those precious moments of primetime silence, Cameron demonstrated with staggering effect the privilege of commemorative exclusivity. He had staked his claim on the public imagination in order to impose on the audience the concept that they should remember what he wanted them to remember. His position had allowed him to set an agenda, and any reference he might have made to other victims of tragedy, an appeal, say, to all those who had lost their lives on the sea, would only dilute the impact of his claim. There was no room for exclusiveness. There was, after all, a product to pitch, Titanic. And in Cameron's view, perhaps anything to extend the power of this brand was acceptable. This, of course, is the brutal reality of any cause. No matter what its moral significance, its right to be remembered, it is at the mercy of those individuals who choose to attach themselves to its needs. From charities to historical calamities to plagues to famines, we are in need of spokespeople who can attach a public face to an issue. In a world of victims, only the most ostentatious will be noticed. In victim culture, this constitutes survival of the fittest. The Ottoman persecution of the Armenians had begun in 1894-6, but under the Young Turk government in World War I became a systematic program to eradicate Turkey's Armenian population. Massacres and forced marches into Syria resulted in the death, it has been estimated, of 1.5 million Armenians. Ararat examines a key moment of that history, the siege of the Armenian population of Van in 1915. A detailed eyewitness account was provided by Dr. Clarence D. Usher, head of the American mission to Van, who tried in vain to intercede with the Ottoman forces under the command of Cevdet Bey, the governor of Van province. Usher's 1917 memoir, An American Physician in Turkey, provides the basis for Egoyan's reconstruction of the siege, as seen in the film within the film, also called Ararat, in which Usher himself is a central character. Egoyan's Ararat, as opposed to Edward Soroyan, the film within the film's Ararat, does not offer a fictionalized account of the genocide so much as a response to its being signally under-publicized, not merely, but actually denied, as Turkish governments have to the present day refused to recognize the Ottoman persecution of the Armenians as a genocide. There was a remarkable scarcity of screen images of the genocide. The only widely seen feature film to include images of Armenian-Turkish conflict during the period remains Elia Kazan's America, America, made in 1963. On one level, Ararat is an attempt to counter this gap, to attest to the facts. On another, the film examines the question of denial and its repercussions, specifically regarding the genocide, but also more generally in terms of personal experience. Egoyan comments, "That is the determining issue of why I made the film. It wasn't to ascertain the fact of genocide. I think we have to be able to find a way to stop talking about this as a film of the Armenian genocide. It is a film about living with the effects of the denial of that event into the present." The story is centered around the shooting of a film, also called Ararat, shot in Toronto about the siege of Van. Its director is Edward Soroyan, a veteran Armenian filmmaker played by Armenian-born singer-actor Charles Aznavour. He and his screenwriter, Ruben, played by Eric Bogosian, attend a lecture by an art historian, Ani, played by Arseniy Khanjan, on the Armenian painter Arshil Gorky, learning that Gorky was present as a boy at the siege of Van. The filmmakers decide to write him into their script as a character and enlist Ani as an advisor. She, meanwhile, is at loggerheads with her stepdaughter, Celia, who blames her for the death of her father. Celia is sleeping with Ani's son, Rafi, whose father was an Armenian terrorist or freedom fighter. Anyway, as you all know, it's a very convoluted script. The complex network of relationships also includes David's son, Philip Brent Carver, a gay partner of Ali, Elias Koteas, the half-Turkish actor cast by Soroyan as Cevdet Bey, the brutal governor of Van. Philip is a guard at the art gallery where the troubled Celia slashes Gorky's The Artist and His Mother, a painting which Ani sees as being of central significance to the identity of diasporan Armenians. From the moment I began to write Ararat, I could anticipate that any film that presented the Armenian Genocide would be accused, from a Turkish point of view, of perpetuating stereotypes. Yet from an Armenian perspective, in terms of stories we'd been told over and over again from the time we were children, the barbaric and vicious images were very real. In this context, the challenge in telling the story of Ararat was threefold. First, I had to find a way of presenting the strongest and most persistent of cultural beliefs with which I had been raised. Secondly, I needed to examine and question the drives and sources that determine those beliefs. And finally, I had to show the emotional foundations of those beliefs as they persist in our culture today. There are those who say I should have told the story more simply, should have concentrated on the film within the film, Ararat. From this perspective, should have focused on setting the record straight. But I never saw this as my cinematic responsibility. Ararat is, in fact, a rare example of epic cinema in the sense of Brecht's famous formulation of the epic as anti-epic. It is a film about history and its private and social construction, in which what matters in the end, and always, is intelligence as opposed to sentiment. So that, to quote Bertolt Brecht from his notes on Mahagoni, spectators are not sucked into the plot, but placed opposite it, their feelings propelled into perceptions. Furthermore, each scene exists for itself, since the work develops in curves. And this is actually an uncanny exact description of both Ararat's script structure and of its mise-en-scène. And indeed, the film is movingly precisely because it desperately attempts to locate, create, agree upon a common reason between various contesting pairs of protagonists, iconically and essentially the most important being Turks and Armenians. The film is therefore not about history so much as it is about history's reconstruction, about its factual and moral restitution. And being Armenian, Egoyan knows that the personal is always political, and vice versa. There is probably not an Armenian in the world today whose extended family is not reconstructed around absence, whose private networks of sentiment and affection are not, in fact, extended reflections in every sense of that word on absence, and even, need it be said, displacement, regret, possibility, diminishment, and existential terror. In this case, the past is, in fact, a foreign country. But Egoyan's point is that we can learn its language and decode its ways, if we are honest enough with ourselves most of all. One of the film's small but many epiphanies is when the Turkish-Canadian character Ali, an actor who plays Cevdet Bey, the Ottoman governor of Van province in the film within the film about the Armenian Genocide, that is Egoyan's central narrative conceit, and it was actually played by the well-known Greek-Canadian actor Elias Koteas, tells the film's young Armenian-Canadian protagonist, Rafi, basically to forget about it, since they were both born in the New World, empire of forgetfulness and repudiation, and that was then, and this is now. Or as another North American director born in Ottoman Turkey himself, Elias Kazan, phrased it autobiographically, America, America. It is this Lethean denial in the guise of affirmation, this river of oblivion that runs through all of us in the New World, and which we navigate all our lives in our sojourning here, that Egoyan contests in Ararat. The title, of course, is as resonant for North American ethnic as America, America, except that the latter asserts an immigrant's amnesia, even if ironically, while the former defines an immigrant's nostos, to use the proper Greek term, for what is weakly described as nostalgia. Even more important than what Egoyan script says, however, is what his film constructs in a way that only film can, merging fictive and real, private and communal, appearance and supposition. Four of the film's 7 main characters, who are ethnic Armenians, are in fact portrayed by actors of Armenian descent. The 20-year-old newcomer David Alpay, as well as Charles Aznavour, Bogosian, Arseniy Khanjan, while the Turkish-Canadian character is played by Greek-Canadian Koteas. If nothing else, this ethnic re-deflection adds a level of existential and affective poignancy, as well as a peculiar kind of estrangement, again very Brechtian, to one's perception of what is actually going on. Koteas' portrayal of Ali and his portrayal of Ali's portrayal of Jevdet Bey struck me in particular. So at this point, I'll show you a clip, an extended clip really from the film. But let's just back up a bit in terms of like talking about where we are. This is basically, we're going to be seeing the film within the film as it's being shot, with the scene where Jevdet Bey is confronting Usher. And as I said, this was based on this actual biography, this account that Clarence Usher had published in 1917. And this account is then adapted by Eric Bogosian's character into this film. But we'll also see these scenes where the driver on the film, this young man, Rafi, who's been stopped by Canadian Customs, is trying to describe his circumstance to a very bewildered Christopher Plummer, who's trying to absorb everything he's hearing. So we'll look at these scenes and then continue the discussion.
Take this back to your American missionary. Pick it up! You take that back to your American missionary. He must sign it. Otherwise, he must accept 50 of my soldiers in the mission compound. You understand?
You said that this character gave something to the boy to take back to the missionary for him to sign.
It was a document stating that Usher refused Turkish protection.
But that's obvious. He was helping protect the Armenians.
Exactly. Actually, Usher and Jevdet Bey had met a few times before. He tried to stop him from carrying out his plans.
What plans?
For genocide. Over 1 million people were killed. An ancient civilization living on ancestral lands. It was systematic and fully planned. The entire Armenian population of eastern Turkey was eliminated.
I need permission to put 50 soldiers with cannon and supplies in your mission compound.
Why?
Well, to protect you, of course.
We're under the protection of the United States of America.
The United States of America. They're so far away.
It won't be safe to send so many Turkish soldiers into the heart of the Armenian quarter. It's bound to cause trouble. What danger are you trying to protect us from?
my soldiers. You must sign the statement that you refuse the protection of the Turkish government.
If Usher signed the document, it would be like giving the Turks permission to slaughter the Americans in the compound, the same way that they were massacring the Armenians outside.
You lost me.
Well, it was the same document that he'd presented to the boy. If the United States government ever made an inquiry into the incident, that statement, the document the Turks wanted Usher to sign, would affirm that the Americans were offered protection, but that they refused.
And if you let them in?
Well, the Turks would use it as a strategic point. With that many soldiers and artillery based in the mission, they'd have a foothold in the Armenian quarter.
The Trojan horse.
Right.
Please do not leave your bags unattended.
So what did he do?
Our premises are part of the United States of America. They're extraterritorial by treaty right, completely neutral. And we will preserve this neutrality to the last.
میکنی دستفی را از دقیقه برد
They were heroes. What happened in Van in April 1915 was an amazing act of self-defense. We hadn't done anything like that since we held back the Persians.
So when did you hold back the Persians?
451.
451.
Well, like I said, we go back.
Can I ask you something?
Huh?
Did you cast me just because I'm half Turkish?
No. It's because I thought you would be perfect for the part.
But being Turkish didn't hurt.
Ah, it didn't hurt, no.
You know, you never asked me what I thought of the history.
What is there to think?
Whether I believed it happened. A genocide.
Well, I'm not sure it matters.
No, I don't want to take up your time. I just. The thing is, when I play a part, it's supposed to come from here, right? Not here, Right? Because I was doing some research, and I think the Turks had a real reason to believe that the Armenians were a threat to their security. I mean, their eastern border was threatened by Russia. And I mean, they believed that the Armenians were going to betray them. So this was war. Populations get moved around all the time. So
and again, thank you for your work.
Ali, we're ready for you.
Hey, you got your car and back. Drive you home.
Yep, let's do it.
Mr. Stroyan.
Yes?
Why didn't you answer him?
Because he's having regrets about playing the part. I can understand. He will receive anger from his people.
But he thinks Turkey was at war with Armenia. Doesn't it bother you that he doesn't get the history?
No, not really.
I mean, why didn't you explain to him that we were citizens, we were Turkish citizens. We had a right to be protected.
Are you driving him home?
Yeah.
What? Take this. Buy him a bottle of champagne. Let him think that he has done something special.
Something special. I'm sorry, Mr. Stroyan, I don't think I understand.
Young man, do you know what still causes so much pain? It's not the people we lost, or the land. It's to know that we could be so hated. Who are these people who could hate us so much? How can they still deny their hatred and so hate us? Hate us even more.
Yeah, that was a good scene.
Thanks.
Must be really weird to get into that headspace.
Yeah.
I mean, I was raised with all these stories, you know, evil Turks and everything, so I'm a little hardened to it all. But what you did today, I mean, it made me feel all that anger again.
Hey, thanks. So I take it you're Armenian?
Well, yeah. Yeah, well, that's what I meant when I said I was, you know, raised to feel out of hatred to the person you're playing.
Right.
You really pulled it off.
Well, it'd be kind of hard to disappoint you.
What do you mean?
Well, you were kind of prepared to hate my character, like you said.
Well, sure. But I'm also kind of suspicious of stuff that's supposed to make me feel anything. You know? So when I was watching you today, like, even though I know you were supposed to make me feel like hating you, I resisted it, but then, I mean, by the end of the scene,
You feel like killing me?
Yeah. My dad was killed trying to assassinate a Turkish diplomat. It was almost 15 years ago. I could never understand what would make him want to murder, what he had to imagine that Turkish ambassador represented. But today you gave me a sense of what was going on in his head. I want to thank you.
Well, you're welcome. What's this?
It's from Edward. He wanted to give it to you. And thanks.
Now, was this before or after my conversation with him?
After. I guess he wants to show there are no hard feelings.
Okay. Thanks.
Were you serious about what you told him? That you don't think it happened?
What, genocide?
Yeah.
Are you gonna shoot me or something? Look, I never heard about any of this stuff when I was growing up. You know? I did some research for the part. From what I read, there were deportations and lots of people died. Armenians and Turks. It was World War I.
Turkey wasn't at war with the Armenians. I mean, just like Germany wasn't at war with the Jews. They were citizens. They were expecting to be protected. That scene you just shot was based on an eyewitness account. Your character, Cevdet Bey, the only reason they put him in Van was to carry out the complete elimination of the Armenian population in Van. There were telegrams, there were communiques.
I'm not saying that something didn't happen.
Something.
Look, I was born here. So were you, right?
Yeah.
This is a new country. So let's just drop the fucking history and get on with it. No one's gonna wreck your home. No one's gonna destroy your family. So, let's go inside and uncork this thing and celebrate.
Do you know what Adolf Hitler told his military commanders to convince them that his plan would work? Who remembers the extermination of the Armenians?
And nobody did. Nobody does.
On the basis of this scene, we can understand the tremendous complexity of historical transposition. Ali, the actor, transformed himself to play a murderous monster. Rafi's father, because of his political convictions, transformed himself into a killer. Is Rafi moved by Ali's performance because of what the actor incarnated, or because of the very process of incarnation? Can this incarnation become a form of testimony? If we acknowledge that survivors might tend to exaggerate the crime, does that make them unreliable? Can an actor who is only playing a role give the viewer the critical distance needed to understand an event? Can a director? Can a film? Who has the authority, be it moral, spiritual, or artistic, to actually tell a story? In the 1960s, Elie Wiesel, the survivor, replaced Anne Frank, the victim, as the incarnation of Holocaust in the United States. In his book, While America Watches, Televising the Holocaust, Jeffrey Chandler suggests that in the 1990s, Steven Spielberg, the creator of the powerful Holocaust film Schindler's List, replaced Elie Wiesel, the survivor, as the new incarnation of the Holocaust in popular culture. This shift in popular interest from individuals who experienced the event to those who represented the event is a telling sign of our times. In creating a film that seeks to recount the story of the Armenian Genocide, this becomes even more complicated by the fact that we have no Anne Frank, no Elie Wiesel, and certainly no Spielberg. While many of our most noted figures perished during the genocide, none of them achieved popular recognition outside of our culture. Armenians haven't had the intense self-scrutiny ignited by a survivor such as Primo Levi. And let me say that I was writing this before Armenian Golgotha came out, which is actually an extraordinary account. And I urge you all to read it if you haven't read it, because it is our Primo Levi in a way. While a few films have been made about the genocide, none of these have received wide commercial distribution in North America. Even the childhood experiences of Arshil Gorky, one of the founders of abstract expressionism and the only famous survivor of the genocide, are not commonly known. For many people, the glimpses of this great painter's life shown in my film have served as an introduction to this important artist. Midway through Ararat, Ani, an art historian specializing in the work of Arshil Gorky, visits the film studio reproduction of the city of Van, where the historic screen epic, the film within the film that you've seen some glimpses of, is set. We gather that this is the place where Gorky had spent his youth, and in an earlier scene, the filmmakers, unaware of this fact until it is revealed to them by Ani in a lecture they have attended, are now eager to incorporate this one famous survivor into their story. While on set, Ani notices that something is wrong, that the representation of Mount Ararat on the painted backdrop is out of place. She points out that it would not be seen from the city of Van. The filmmakers respond that they have taken poetic license with the location, a concept that is entirely foreign to the intellectual art historian. Indeed, much of the film within the scene seems curiously interpretive. The actors portraying Jevdet Bey and the American missionary Clarence Usher are acting their parts in a style that borders on historical kitsch. From a contemporary perspective, this film within the film is heavy-handed and old-fashioned, as we can see from the clips you saw. My decision to present the film within the film this way was not born from a sense of perversity or ironic detachment. Instead, I was trying to express what those images of the past would feel like to a culture that has never seen them before. What does it mean to visualize scenes of horror and heroism that history has ignored? Wouldn't they seem exaggerated? My intention in showing the extreme scenes of killings, rapes, and sexual torture was not only to make people think specifically about the Armenian Genocide, but to make the viewer consider the creation of horror and how these histories are created and passed on. The enduring legacy of the Armenian Genocide is not the specific nature of the crime. The last century is, of course, rife with unprecedented horrors, but the fact that a calamity of this scale can be systematically denied by perpetrators and, until recently, the rest of the world. Ararat shows how the trauma of living with unresolved history can be transmitted from one generation to the next. The dysfunctional nature of the film within the film is a representation of the state of living with memories that have been denied. To repeat the idea we heard earlier on from Papas, the idea has to be seen from a Brechtian perspective. It's a film about history and its private and social construction, in which what matters in the end is intelligence as opposed to sentiment. As we can see from the extended passages of Edward Soroyan's Ararat, his film looks like something that was made long ago. It seems like a cinematic artifact from another time, since the idea behind making it, while full of earnest good intention, is hardly a reflection of the state of contemporary consciousness. As Armenians, we've heard all those stories. We know all the cliches about evil Turks, the scenes of torture, and the stories of what happened on the death marches. While it's certainly important to show this material, and my film does, it's also important to address the limitations of such traditional representation. While these are the images that every Armenian has been waiting to see and to have the world see, they do not reflect who we are today. These scenes, in and of themselves, cannot make up for almost 100 years of denial. Indeed, Rafi's whole journey in the film must be born of this desire to shoot something authentic to what he feels. If Mount Ararat is a painted backdrop on the set, then he will travel to Turkey and take a shot of the real mountain. He dreams of bringing back this image so that it can be cut into the film. He dreams of adding digital effects of people marching. He wants to remake Soroyan's old-fashioned cinematic document into images that mean something to him. All of the Armenian characters in the film are somehow involved in this process of creating meaning and significance through cultural artifact. From the unknown ancient architects of the churches of Ani and Akhtamar, to the forgotten photographer in the city of Van taking a portrait of Gorky and his mother, to Gorky painting his masterpiece years later, to Ani writing a book about the making of this masterpiece, to Rubin writing a screenplay which will include bits of Ani's book, to Edward Soroyan filming these scenes, to Rafi finally shooting his own scene, both on mysterious film and digital video diaries, as well as telling a customs officer about what he witnessed about the making of Edward's movie. Through this McLuhan-esque array of hot and cool mediums, all of these characters are involved in a process of cultural transmission. In most cases, perceived limitations or inadequacies on the part of one teller lead to a further embellishment on the part of the next. All of the post-genocide stories are driven by a common anxiety, the anxiety of not being heard. And of course, this leads back to my role as a filmmaker. I am ultimately responsible for the portrayal of these characters. I have chosen to depict them. They are contemporary characters whose collective history has never been made into a popular miniseries, or a groundbreaking television movie, or an artistically hailed film seen by millions of people all over the world. These are all characters who are somehow involved in making a film that doesn't even promise to be that successful. From what we see of Edward Soroyan's Arad at the premiere, it seems condemned to be dismissed as a piece of pro-Armenian propaganda. But let us understand where these images come from. They arise out of fear. They come from people who feel that they have to scream in order to be heard. Edward Soroyan's film could never tell a proper narrative, since there's no conclusion to his story. The images in his film, though based on the eyewitness account of Clarence Usher, are concentrated expressions of what has become our legacy. There's been no chance to develop motifs or extend dramatic approaches, since the essential story has remained untold. Of course, we have important works of literature by writers such as Hagop Oshagan, Vahan Toravens, but they remain, for the most part, largely unknown and untranslated. The most famous novel about the Armenian Genocide, The 40 Days of Musa, Dagh, was written by an Austrian Jew, Franz Werfel. Published as a prescient warning call against the horrors of racial hatred in 1933, it was planned as a film to be directed by Ruben Mamoulian until MGM bent to Turkish pressure and the project was abandoned. Over and over again, Turkish sources have steadfastly protected their position, effectively demonizing the victim and rehabilitating the perpetrator. Sorry, I'm just skipping through all the stuff I was going to lay on you, which I'm not going to anymore. From the moment the film premiered at Cannes 10 years ago now, there was one school of thought that asserted that the film should have been a cinematic monument to what had happened. Any film that presented the Armenian Genocide had the responsibility to set the record straight in black and white terms, to be, in short, what Edward Soroyan was trying to create in the film within the film. According to one reviewer, the fact that I didn't dwell on this historical representation was, quote, either an exercise in pretension or timidity that exploits the tragedy. Curiously, this response has come almost entirely from non-Armenians who, in the words of Jonathan Foreman of the New York Post, have stated that the event deserves a more engaged and honest treatment. Many of these critics have felt exasperated that the devices I chose to use seem to complicate unnecessarily the presentation of history. This was a story that needed to be told, so why not tell it in a straightforward way? I've never received such a divided response to my work until I made Chloe, but that's another story. The Washington Post printed 2 reviews of the film, 2 reviews on the day of its release. While one critic complained that I was trying to say way too much and had worked too hard on this movie, another, in the very same edition, observed that I seemed to agree with Henry James that historical fiction is neither. This critic concluded that Ararat was successful in leading the viewer through a thorny and complicated story, addressing moral ambiguity without succumbing to it. As you can see, unlike many of my colleagues, I do read my reviews. And what has surprised me is the ease with which the ideas in the film, ideas which I consider to be timely and highly pertinent to the world that we're living in now, can be dismissed by the simple claim that the film is trying to do too much. Any plot summary of Arad which any critic is bound to supply, quickly becomes bogged down by the film's various subplots and secondary characters. You could see that happening as I was trying to recount it in front of you tonight. For my part, with some degree of distance now, I still find it impossible to imagine how any of the characters or circumstances could be further tailored. Again, my work might have taken a different shape if a more popular movie version of the Armenian Genocide had already existed, but this was not the case. My film had to tell the story of what happened, why it's denied, how it's denied, and what happens when you continue to deny. As I said earlier, Ararat is a story about the transmission of trauma. It's cross-cultural and intergenerational. The grammar of the film uses every possible tense and mood available to tell its story, from the basic pillars of the past, present, and the future, to the subjective, the past perfect, the past not so perfect, and the past would be perfect if it wasn't so conditional. I firmly believe that this was the only way the story could be told. It's dense and complex because the issues are so dense and complex. There is an uneasy alchemy that occurs when one combines elements of cinema, glamour, and atrocity. Any act of tyranny or terror involves a dehumanizing of the other. Can a scene that depicts an act of terror ever truly serve to counter this effect? If an act of genocide is only made possible by the abstraction of other human beings, can a film about genocide serve to rectify this violence? Referring back to the pivotal scene where Rafi drives Ali home that we watched, he thanks the actor who played the monster Jevdet Bey for incarnating the evil that destroyed his race. Ali responds by dismissing the young man's compliment, saying that he was prepared to hate his character, that he was preconditioned by his community, and that any response was the result of this preconditioning. In other words, his response was to be expected, and its value is thus diminished. Rafi says that he's suspicious of anything that is designed to provoke a reaction, of anything that's supposed to make him feel something. But what Ali did with his performance somehow transcended those concerns. His dramatization was so compelling that it made Rafi feel all that anger again. Is this a good thing? What can it lead to? Is it a progressive energy? Does it solve anything? I felt that issues raised in this film would address the idealistic questions, yet there's something fundamentally naive about this attitude, about the belief that a film could ever tell the true story. Isn't this exactly Rafi's dilemma as he watches Edward's film shoot? What is it about this cinematic artifact that makes Rafi need to go to Turkey with the improbable goal of shooting the real Mount Ararat? What is it that drives the young man's need for authenticity? In the course of making the first commercially distributed film dealing with the Armenian Genocide, I was faced with an odd variant of the old philosophical quandary. If a tree falls in an empty forest where no one can hear it, does it still make a sound? The genocide of a people had occurred now almost 100 years ago, but too much of the world somehow seems to be surrounded by this empty forest of denial. Did this atrocity still make a sound? Did it need a film to make it happen? In the sense of registering this event with the rest of the world. In our media-hungry culture, would the books and the archives and the survivors' stories ever be enough? I realize that there are some who have been angered by my insistence on asking these questions in the face of something so massively cataclysmic as the genocide of a people, especially when in this case it is my own people. But I must stress that I am concerned not only with aesthetics focusing on the unreliability of language and representation. Rather, I'm convinced that it is only through these questions that the emotional nature of my subject could be addressed. I wasn't simply interested in making a film that probes our need for making and watching films. This type of postmodernist exercise has become very tiresome and so hermetically sealed within its own world of semiotics and theory that it misses the reason why most people go to see movies. People go to see films because they expect to be moved. When they go to see a movie about a genocide and its residual effects on generations of survivors and their children, they expect to be really moved. Which brings us back to the Titanic story. What I had found so suspicious about the commemorative silence imposed on the international audience that night was the unholy marriage of real human suffering with real human arrogance. By winning the Oscar for Best Picture that night, James Cameron had forever cemented his identity as a filmmaker with the history of the Titanic. He would be responsible for the way a new generation would now remember the event, and yet, I believe that there's something about the sheer scale of this type of blockbuster filmmaking that somehow resists the way in which history is most effectively passed. In making Ararat, I wanted to show how the truth is not to be found in the epic scenes of deportation and massacre, but in the intimate moments shared by individuals, between strangers in a hallway, between workers on a film set, and most profoundly in the conversations between parents and their children. Any blockbuster attempt to amplify the event from the very private turmoil its private memory evokes is to diminish, or at least to misrepresent, the essential aspect of its meaning. At the end of the film, in a dark room in a customs office, a truth is finally revealed. Raffi appeals to David, the customs officer, to accept his testimony in an act of faith beyond any proof. After the collapse of his story, he is left only with his words. This moment that is shared between the customs officer and the young man he has been interrogating has come from a deep sense of compassion, and I firmly believe that it is only from this capacity, the ability to feel someone else's experience of the world, that we can draw any hope for reconciliation. Everything else leads to torture, murder, and yes, even genocide. Compassion leads to the revelation and disclosure of truth in all its interconnectedness and devastating elaboration. And compassion certainly cannot exist if one's energies are used to conceal. In making a film that dealt with this history, I was dealing with a legacy of concealment and denial. As a result, I needed to tell this story with a forest of questions and the sound of many possible answers. I needed to present Ararat with pristine complexity, showing how history is often created from the effort to accommodate differing accounts of the same event. From the stories of survivors passed on to children and grandchildren, to the industrial needs of commercial entertainment, to the private and sacred mythologies of art, the collective human linkage of experience is both the wonder and tragedy of our condition. That ends the formal part of my speech, and thank you. In preparing for this, I was going through my archive and I was looking at stuff, and I found, I went on this tour around the world, really, because this film was released in 30 different countries. And at one point I was in Japan, and it was a very interesting experience because there were the journalists in Japan who were very interested in the film from the point of view of denial and victim culture, because, of course, this is the Japanese trailer for the film, which is interesting. I'll just give you this context. So I was talking to people, of course, as victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also as people who have denied their own massacre of Nanjing. So there was a lot of discussion around the film. And at one point, the distributor took me to this computer and said, "This is the trailer that we're thinking of." And I found it really interesting to see how a different culture was cutting the film to present it to its own people. And I photographed it off a computer, so the quality is really bad. And I don't understand Japanese, so I really don't know what they're saying. Maybe someone else does here. But it's just interesting to kind of see as a visual montage of how this other culture tried to present the film to its own public.
Remains one of the most influential figures.
How she suffered, and now we are making this film.
What's the story about?
Over 1 million people were killed.
You're sickened because that painting is a repository of our history. Եթե թուրքերը քեզ բռնեն, քումար լեզուդ երբեք պիտի չմոռնաս։ Եթե ողջ մնաս, այս բոլորը պատմելու համար է, որ ողջ պիտի մնաս։
You have to be the son of a terrorist.
Your father died for something he believed in.
I just wish I had some idea what that was.
When you look at this painting, can you understand so much pain?
Mom, I miss you too.
Kazan, たとえ僕たちのふるさとが滅ぼされても、あなたの手のぬくもりは一生忘れない。あららとの聖母。
Finally, a film about the transmission of history through intergenerational complexity, but probably that's not what he's saying. But I just found it really, really moving, actually, to kind of see again how, as a filmmaker, my job is to tell one story and to find the images that tell it. But of course, once that film is in the world, people will use those images in whatever way they want to. I've had strange experiences where Armenian kindergarten teachers say, would it be okay with you if I clipped the film in such a way that we're only showing the scenes of the film within the film, and I have my own voiceover explaining to the children what they're seeing? And I'm going, I could never give you permission for doing that because I know you're going to do it anyway, whether or not I say you can. And it's sort of the nature of how images exist in our society now, right? You make them, they're transmitted, and then people will do what they want with them. There was a point when there was some authority over that, but there isn't anymore. So it's in some ways the film is also reflecting on how volatile and how open to interpretation any image can be, especially when it's in the hands of whoever chooses to show it in whatever way. I would never have made that trailer for the film, but it's interesting that that's the trailer that was used for that particular population. And I can assure you that each country that showed the film made its own specific trailer. Those of you who can go on the internet can see how Miramax promoted the film in the US, which is a different trailer than we used in Canada. And it's always an interesting thing when I'm asked to give approval, because I can't really. I don't know how it is you're wanting to sell the film. That's your job. It's your job to market it. I'll come to the country and I'll speak about it, but very often I'm not going to speak about it in the way that's going to make it as commercial as you may want. I had this experience when I learned about this when Miramax was distributing Exotica. And they had this cross-country tour planned for me from San Francisco and LA all across. And after I got to Seattle, I suddenly was pulled. And I said, oh, no, that's okay. We don't need you to do any more. And they suddenly had one of the actresses, instead. And I realized later on that the way I was speaking about the film was not the way they wanted to present the film. And if you look at the trailer that Miramax did for Exotica, you can see it's being promoted as a sex thriller and hardly a study of voyeurism and a cerebral kind of contemplation of mourning and loss that I made the film to be. So it's an interesting position that we're in as a filmmaker. But anyway, I'm open for questions if anyone has any. Okay, I'll repeat the questions. Was it ever screened in Turkey? Well, that's a very interesting story. It was, before the film was even released, there was a book by Professor Sedek Lassener called Ararat Master Propaganda Art. And basically his position was that my entire career trajectory probably began with that afternoon in Gérard Lebardian's garden, where I was programmed to become an art filmmaker. The Armenian community had kind of calculated this entire career for me so that I would end up with this bomb that was Ararat at the Cannes Film Festival. The whole thing had been paved for me to somehow create this alternate form of artistic terrorism. Seriously. The book laid out all these facts and got a lot of them wrong, besides the fact that not a dollar from the Armenian community went into making this film. It was, as I said, supported by a Hungarian Jew and then supported by the Weinsteins with the Miramax. So it was this incredibly fabricated idea. So the film there was a huge resistance. But then a Turkish distributor saw the film in Berlin and really responded to it and bought the film for distribution in Turkey. And in the days leading up to the release, the Grey Wolves, the ultra-nationalist group, basically set out these posters saying that they would actually firebomb any theater that was playing the film. And basically the film was pulled from distribution. It finally got shown on Turkish cable television with many of the scenes of the film within the film cut out. And there was a forum with the late Hrant Dink where he was talking about the film. He was not a fan of the film. He felt that it went way too far in creating these scenes of horror, and that wasn't necessary, and that it wasn't going to help a dialogue. And we had an interesting conversation about that at the time. He came to the premiere in Cannes, and was, I think, like many Armenians, wasn't quite sure where to position it at the time. I mean, it's been very interesting in the 10 years since, where there have been a number of papers now written about the piece, and some of them I was trying to allude to unsuccessfully, because they're really very dense and actually are some way smarter about the movie than I am. I react to these things quite intuitively, and even one of the reasons I let that scene play for so long was that I went, oh, that's actually what I feel about the movie right there. It's not what I'm saying about it. These are, my talent is to make images, is not necessarily to present intellectual ideas, but there's been incredible conversation around it. There was a seminar at the University of Tel Aviv a few years ago, and it was just fascinating to hear from that perspective, from a Jewish perspective, almost a fantasy of what might have happened if the Nuremberg trials hadn't taken place, if the Nazis had not assumed culpability for the Holocaust. So it becomes this odd experiment for them, I think, in a totally different way than I would have ever intended. So I can say that for all of its flaws, I still think it's probably the only film I know of that deals with the subject matter of the repercussions of denial from one generation to the other at a political level, and how it kind of infuses this family. My only abiding criticism was that I wish I had longer to work on the film. I mean, I had this window of 18 months where it had to get made. So I took this screenplay that I'd written in my 20s and kind of fit it into this movie, and I wanted to say everything. I wanted to talk about the Turkish position. You'll see that in the point of view with Ali, where he presents that idea. I wanted to show, I needed to explain the history, because one of the real problems for a non-Armenian audience is that most people have no idea what you're talking about. So this idea of Christopher Plummer playing that character, someone who's never heard of it, who's being told the story for the first time, became really, really critical. And he did an amazing job. I mean, he, himself, says it's one of his most challenging roles, because he's really responding not as the Christopher Plummer character, just as a regular person to this story. And it was just so thrilling to see him win the Academy Award a few weeks ago, because, it was really, he was really devoted to being in this movie. Yeah, I think it needs repeated viewings, probably. It's too much to take the first time. Yes?
Have you ever thought about doing another film? You seem to have a lot of things that you're saying now that maybe you would like to revisit.
Well, I don't know if I do it as a film. I'm obsessed with the story of Aurora Mardiganian, and I think that that's a story. This is this young survivor who came to the U.S. At the age of 17. She arrived at Ellis Island, and she was met by this American-Armenian couple who, do people know this story? Oh, well, then you have to wait till because it's an amazing story. And actually, Zorian, in their oral history, actually taped her, we've now found, which is kind of remarkable. I'll tell it to you in brief, because it's kind of an amazing story. She came to the U.S. looking for her sole remaining relative, which was her brother, and had no address. So she basically was approached by this couple, and they said, look, the only way that we're going to be able to tell this or get the story out and find your brother is if it goes to press. So they brought in a journalist from the New York Post, I think it was, or it wasn't the Times, but he wrote this story, and the Hollywood producer read this in the paper and thought, that'd make an amazing movie, and optioned her story. And the first film about the Armenian Genocide was a silent film that was released in Hollywood in 1919 called Auction of Souls, or Ravished. And it's entirely lost. There's a 10-minute fragment that has been found in really bad shape. But this was the first film that actually dealt with atrocity, historic atrocity. It was made in the US, it was released, it was really successful, and it's all but disappeared. And the story of that film is just interesting to me, especially since she actually appeared in the movie herself. And later, never really had much of a career as an actress besides that, and actually died a forgotten figure in a nursing home. But fortunately, we do have this oral testimony of her history. So there's something there. I'm not sure if it's a film or a play, though, really. I'm not so sure if I want to make another film about it. I think I've sort of said most of what I want to say, but I really wish someone else would. I think that there was a film that my wife was involved with that the Taviani brothers made
a few years later called The Lark Farm, but unfortunately never got released. And in some ways it's not dissimilar to the film within the film that we're seeing here, strangely enough. It sort of feels like it's from another time. It doesn't really feel like a contemporary historic epic, and maybe that's one of the reasons. And that's one of the real problems with any film production is you can make it, but to get it out there, to get it seen, is a whole other story. And in this regard, we've been incredibly lucky with Ararat because the Weinstein brothers were very, very devoted to the movie, and at that time that they made it, they happened to have a
deal with Disney. So you can now go to any video store and pick up the DVD, which is kind of remarkable because it was actually released in the States through the Disney Corporation, which is also one of the incredible things that happened with the protest against the film, because in the week that it was being released, I think the Disney website was like flooded, like basically broke down because of all the letters of protest that were coming in from Turkey against the release of the film.
Did Weinstein get protested also?
Oh yeah, for sure. But the thing is that they thrive on controversy and protest. And we had a screening of the film at the University of the Library of Congress to open the film, and that was like an amazing event. And so it was as good a release as could have been hoped for. Yes.
That in your Sweet Hereafter, there's a lot of similar elements. I mean, in a way, it's like a trial run, if I can, from the outside, say, as far as the arc of your own directing. And so a lot of these elements are there, a lot of the similar kinds of reflections that the characters go through on the margins and questioning as far as trying to figure out what's happened, bringing out the truth and the tragedy of it. And of course, these are two very different kinds of approaches that you take to these two very different, of course, historic, but as well as universal tragedies. So I'm wanting you to compare, to talk about the two of them, and then maybe, unlike the last question, not to think of what other film you would do, but then how differently would you narrate Ararat?
Well, I think the real question is that one that I posed kind of awkwardly, which is this idea of distance. How do you present calamity when the form of cinema is so present? It's interesting because I was just in Boston and they were I was getting this award, and they were showing clips from the films, and they showed that clip from The Sweet Hereafter of the bus crash, and it surprised me. I hadn't seen it for a long time, but it's very distant. You're not anywhere. You're watching it from the point of view of the father on the side of the lake seeing this happen, and the conventional Hollywood approach would be to be right in the bus, and to actually see the screaming kids, but you're outside of it. And this idea of, as I said, taking this Brechtian approach where you are, and I hope I was clear when I was saying that, you're looking at it through intellect as opposed to sentiment. You are actually reacting to it as something which you are understanding as a construction, but then trying to identify your own feeling and position in regards to that. That to me is a much more interesting and ultimately more emotional approach. Because the other one actually gives you an immediate satisfaction, but it doesn't really stay, and you don't really have the experience of what it means to suffer, what it means to feel pain. Because pain is not something that is resolved easily. It's something that lingers in unexpected ways. And that's always been, to me, something I've been very interested in studying. And I think it's also, the one other clip I was going to show, I don't know if there's time, but is the scene of the Siamanto poem of the dance, because to me that's an interesting aspect in the film where there's this period of refraction. You're seeing it told by someone who's seeing it told by someone who's seeing it told by someone. You have, even in Siamanto's poem, it starts off by this account of a German woman who had seen it telling the story to someone else, which Siamanto then transcribes. And then in this version, the screenwriter then uses that poem in his screenplay. And the director then interprets that screenplay. And then Rafi sees that scene being shot on set. And then he then tells the story to Christopher Plummer. So by the time that story is told and retold and retold, it's this transmission of horrifying pain, which cannot help but be interpreted and refracted by the feelings of the viewer, including you, of course, the viewer then watching this parade of things. I mean, we can look at that scene if we have time, maybe we don't, but it's like, to me, it's this really pristine sort of example of what happens with this idea of refracted mourning, if that's the right term. And cinema is very interested. It can deal with that in a way that novels and other art forms can't, because we believe in what we're seeing so clearly. We are there, and in a way that in theater or in novels, we are distanced by the very process of our role as a witness. Any other questions? Yes. Ayo, Avli love him, Shad love gas. Tishpakthorn im Hainen Shad Zoror, Che Paitias Gaskana Mayo. You're learning or you're trying?
No, but I had the same experience that my dad wouldn't speak Armenian, so we could be assimilated.
Yeah. Yeah, it's possible. It's really, it's how you define need, right? It's like it's a question of like, but it's obviously a beautiful language, and if Mr. Bardakshan, Dr. Bardakshan is here, he's got the book that can actually help you, because that was the book I used, Introduction to Modern Western Armenian. So.
We'll take one more question. First, let me thank you for a really wonderful lecture, and I think you should give that lecture with all the pieces in it, because I found it extremely effective to have 3 or 4 voices, and it matches.
Yeah, it was. I think what it was is that at a certain point, it felt like the Peter Pappas, who really adored the film. It sounded like I was complimenting myself in this bizarre way, and I felt very, very. It didn't feel that way when I was reading it, but as I was saying it out, it felt really perverse that I was. Yeah. There you go. So I just felt like I was like bragging, and I didn't want it to come off that way. And then the other one. So if I was doing it, I'd tailor it a bit differently. I didn't mean to come out here and brag. It's not the bragging lecture after all. It's meant to be more informative than that. But thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.